It's official, Missouri football with its fourth best AP finish since the moon landing. And speaking of the moon, well, Eli Drinkwitz and his agent shot for the moon and got it. Let's talk about some crazy company that Eli Drinkwitz is in terms of money and more. Coming up now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150. If your team wins, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And I want to start today with the Tigers finishing 8th in the final Associated Press poll. Of course, Michigan, as predicted here on this program before the college football playoff started. Yes, the Michigan Wolverines are your national champions. And, well, with that final AP poll, 8th, not too shabby by Missouri, and importantly, ahead of Ole Miss and LSU. That's what's most important, right? But that's actually the 10th time Missouri has finished in the top 10 in the AP poll. But really, if you cut it off, as I said in my tease there, just the 4th top 10 since the moon landing, the 4th best finish since then. Well, I'm actually including the 1969 season there, of course, since the moon landing was in July of that offseason that year. So that just shows you we're going way, way back. So if we even cut it off after that 69 campaign, of course, the 1970 Orange Bowl participants there, you got 2007 and 2013. Those teams finished 4th and 5th, respectively, in the AP. Those are the only two really in the modern era. I'll say since Nixon ended the gold standard, the last vestiges of that. How about that for a cutoff in 1971? So that just shows you what an amazing season Missouri had this year. I wanted to just give you some quick historical context there for you, because a lot of those top 10 seasons, 3 of them were in the 1960s, one in 1939, one in 1941, and another even back before that. I don't have that number with me, but I realize I am missing one season here. Must go back even before 1939. So again, thank you to the Missouri Tigers, Eli Drinkwitz, and everybody once again for just a phenomenal season that I'm never going to forget. No doubt about that. So when it comes to Eli Drinkwitz and his latest contract extension, well, I think a lot of people were perturbed in the previous offseason that Drinkwitz was extended, and you could sort of understand why. But I think, unfortunately or fortunately, or frankly, it just is what it is, that's the cost of doing business in modern college football. And we found out the literal cost of doing business by an open records request here by PowerMizzou.com. According to them, the first 2 deals, the first 2 years of Drinkwitz's new renegotiated contract extension here will pay him $9 million a year, upwards of $9.5 million in his final season. Of course, some significant incentives in that contract as well. But again, I like to provide context here. You on Locked On Mizzou. Fortunately, they had some good context over at Power Mizzou, and that annual guarantee puts him right in there with Lane Kiffins, who is about $9 million a year. So is Mark Stoops and Josh Heupel as well. Of course, I'm talking about the Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Kentucky coaches. So really only trailing Brian Kelly of LSU, Nick Saban, of course, of Alabama, and Kirby Smart of Georgia. So really, obviously that's an aggressive move by Missouri, but I like it, quite honestly. I like the aggressive maneuver there because quite honestly, as I was pointing out to my dad as we were walking into the Georgia basketball game the other day, I love that Missouri is doing things like, hey, 4 for $24 to get into the stadium. They're running deals all the time, telling them, trying to get people into the stadium, essentially, not trying to wring every single dollar out of the live audience. And they shouldn't have to, because these days, and this is true of just about every live event, every live sporting event, professional wrestling, even whatever it might be. Back in the day, you got most of your money from the live gate, the live audience. These days, it's all about the television audience. That's where you get your money from these giant media companies. So basically what I'm trying to say is that shouldn't affect the people like me, season ticket holders and people like that. I don't expect suddenly, because Eli Drinkwitz is making $9 million a year, that Missouri's going to shoot its hot dog and popcorn prices back up. I just don't see there being any correlation there whatsoever. So if Missouri has that money to spend, I actually love that they're signaling to the rest of the country, and in particular the Southeastern Conference, that, hey, we may have just lost our defensive coordinator to LSU, but we're going to be right in there competing with maybe not LSU and Georgia and Alabama for money. I'll give you that. But we should be right in there competing with anybody, at least right in this moment, who isn't maybe those top 3 elite schools in terms of spending. Maybe throw in Texas A&M in there just in terms of the dollars and cents as well. Now, Missouri offensive coordinator Kirby Moore got a nice extension of somewhere in the ballpark of 50% as well. He made $850,000 in 2023. This season, it's going to be a guarantee of $1.2 million and then another $1.3 in 2025. And of course, we know that Missouri was willing to pay Blake Baker $2 million a year to be their defensive coordinator as well. So again, just the money in this sport right now doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. In fact, I'd say inflation might be having a bit to do with that particular phenomenon, without diving too deeply into the economic state of this particular country. But you know what? Here's the thing. Speaking of context, I think if this were an episode of Sesame Street, this would be the word of the day, would be context. And I've heard a lot of names bandied about in terms of who Missouri's next defensive coordinator should be. And I think it's natural for people to ask about Phil Parker, who is the defensive coordinator at Iowa. But again, I've heard a lot of people say, hey, why does nobody talk about this guy? Why does his name never come up for jobs outside of Iowa? Why is he never even mentioned? Well, again, this is where context is important. It's quite simple. It's because Phil Parker has been under Kirk Ferentz, I believe, for his entire tenure at the University of Iowa, if not his entire tenure, basically for his entire tenure, maybe save a season or two here and there. But for the last 25 years, Phil Parker has been a coach, originally the secondary coach. Now he's the defensive coordinator for the past 12 seasons. Obviously not a young man at this point. I'm sure he's getting taken care of just fine as well in terms of money. He's got to be making over $1 million a year plus at this point. So He just seems like a guy who is the exception. I've talked a lot about this week how these assistant coaches in particular, and head coaches, let's be honest, but in particular assistant coaches are really mercenaries at this point in time. So let's not be surprised when any of them go anywhere. Well, Phil Parker is the one guy where you can say, yeah, I'd be pretty shocked if he actually went anywhere. So I think we can check that name off the list. And coming up on the program, I want to talk about the Missouri and Kentucky basketball game tonight in Lexington, and a little bit on the state of the Missouri basketball program as well. Again, some further context. Go crazy, Elmo. I said it once again. But you know what? Before we get there, let's talk about Jace Medical, because obviously we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of real life. But can we just talk for a minute about preparing for real life? According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. This is less than ideal, and I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if one of my daughters or my wife got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from the life-saving medication that they need. Well, thankfully, we'll be okay because of Jace Medical. The Jace case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, among others. This stuff could happen to any of us. Visit jacemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. So go to jacemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. That's Locked On Sports Today on YouTube. And let's talk about Kentucky. You know, the Wildcats, it's a little interesting, obviously, what's happened. Believe it or not, the Cats, I believe I have this correct, have not won an NCAA tournament game since 2019. Can that possibly be correct? Let me actually double check that really quickly here while I vamp. But what's really interesting here for the Wildcats is that for the last few years, John Calipari has kind of gone away from the one-and-done model that had been so successful for him in his time at Kentucky. And, of course, what's changed the last couple years? The portal. So Calipari dipped into the portal. Of course, Oscar Tshiebwe was a big part of that, the former West Virginia product. But while Tshiebwe put up a lot of big numbers for the Wildcats the last couple years, he and a lot of those transfers, for whatever reason, just could not ever capitalize in the NCAA tournament. Maybe that's just a fluke. Who the heck knows? But all I know is this season, it's much more of a traditional one-and-done type Kentucky team. You've got DJ Wagner, Justin Edwards, Reed Shepherd, 3 true freshmen who all play a lot. And again, although to be fair, they are supplementing those 3 guys, I would say, with last year's transfer Antonio Reeves and this year's main transfer, big man Trey Mitchell, who you may remember from stops at UMass, Texas, and West Virginia, now is wound up in Kentucky. So maybe him and Sean East could have some stories about tales from the road with those well-traveled young men. No doubt about that. But bottom line, with Missouri and Kentucky, it's really hard to see tonight where the Tigers have an advantage in this game. I hate to say it. I really do. It's one of those things where, hey, you hope the 3-point variance goes your way and just pray. If anything, Missouri should probably shoot more 3-pointers than it did against Georgia, just to really up the variance statistically, because, again, as I look at this game statistically, I'm just not really seeing any other path to victory necessarily. And while that's obviously a grim outlook for tonight, to be honest, it's a bit of a grim outlook for the rest of the season for the Missouri basketball team at this point. But honestly, I'm sticking with this story until proven otherwise. I'm just not worried about the Dennis Gates program or Dennis Gates in general at this point. Not really at all. And yes, maybe Dennis Gates has some stuff to learn. Hey, guess what? We all do, right? I'm basically Dennis Gates' age. Eli Drinkwitz is basically the same age as us too. And my point is, hey, remember Eli Drinkwitz in his second season with Missouri. Things weren't going so great, especially at the beginning of 2021. It really is okay if Dennis Gates is still learning a little bit. But I think mostly what happened, obviously, as I've said before, the portal additions just have not quite worked out. Missed out on a couple prominent guys in Caden Shedrick and Matthew Cleveland, who have been good players at the Power 5 level. Just missed out on them, reportedly, this offseason. And when it comes to learning, by the way, Isn't everybody learning right now in the transfer portal era? I just pointed out how John Calipari is still obviously calibrating. Calibrating. That was pretty good. But seriously, he's calibrating how many transfers he should take versus how many high school recruits he should take. This is basically what everybody in the country is trying to calibrate right now. And by the way, just as another example, you don't like the Eli Drinkwitz in year 2 example? Well, how about this one? Let's check out how UCLA is doing this season. I think we'd all have to agree that Mick Cronin has been a great hire for the Bruins. Yeah, his first year they were in the NIT, and then the next year they're in the Final Four, followed by 2 consecutive Sweet 16 appearances, including the win total, by the way, in the regular season going up each of the last 3 years, peaking with 31 wins last season. Well, again, how are the Bruins doing this season after winning 31 games last year? Well, they're 6-9. Yowzers. And as far as I can tell, Cronin did not take a single player in the transfer portal. He's trusting his own high school scouting and development to not only work out. I'm sure he thought this team was going to be better this season than it's been so far. Below 500 is pretty astonishing. Losing to teams like Cal State Northridge is pretty unheard of for UCLA. But I think Cronin is probably going to stay the course here. Next season, you'd think maybe he'll add a guy or two in the portal, but it seems like he's trusting his own high school scouting and development, and maybe that'll work out next season. Who knows? I'm betting it probably will. I'm just saying, long story short here, I'm still betting on Dennis Gates. I also think, to be fair to Dennis Gates, I think he's been the victim of some bad luck too. As I pointed out, Jontay, the transfer from Colorado State, well, he was the first guy Missouri added in the portal this previous offseason. That tells you that he was obviously a priority, and unfortunately, he's had some kind of injury that has either kept him off of his game, out of rhythm, or unable to play, maybe some combination of both. But obviously that has not worked out so far, and there really wasn't much that I think Dennis Gates could do about that. That was just bad luck. Sometimes it happens, and sometimes you just can't quite catch a break. And really, the more I think about it, that kind of reminds me of Cuonzo Martin's second season. Of course, we all remember Michael Porter Jr., his first season. That was terrible luck for Cuonzo. Well, the second season, arguably even worse luck when Jontay Porter tears his ACL in the offseason, doesn't play 1 minute of that second season for Cuonzo Martin. And you know what? I want to talk a little bit more about Jontay Porter. In fact, now that I've brought up Jontay, he's actually accomplished something pretty incredible, in my opinion. You may have missed it, but Jontay's actually played 3 games here recently for the Toronto Raptors. So I want to talk about him and compare him a little bit, and very favorably, to Cody Schrader as well. But first, I want to tell you about FanDuel, because if the NFL regular season is over, and it is, we've still got the playoffs, baby, and that means you got to go to FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet, not only just sides and totals, but of course futures as well. Like, hey, the Heisman Trophy, Brady Cook for next season, 30-1 to win the Heisman. Luther Burden, 100-1. I definitely like the Luther Burden odds better. I know normally the quarterback wins it, but I kind of get the feeling that Missouri is going to be pushing Burden for that Heisman Trophy in the offseason. And you know what? Those Heisman voters are very, very easy to manipulate. But regardless of what you think, you got to go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an extra point. It's FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Cody Schrader, Missouri's stud running back, of course, gets a ton of credit, and as well he should, for his massive work ethic, his tenacity, his stick-to-itiveness. And again, as well he should. How many people, if their dream was to play at Missouri, to play major college football, and didn't get any offers out of high school, was at Truman State for that period of time, still basically after accomplishing what he did at Truman State, even Missouri was saying, well, we'll give you a preferred walk-on offer. We're not going to give you any scholarships. How many people would have just said, the heck with football, I'm done with it? Or at the very least, just been content to be a really good player at Truman State, not have to drudge through basically fighting through, 5 or 6 guys who are ahead of him at the very least on the depth chart when he arrived on campus in Columbia. How many guys are able to do that, able to accomplish what he accomplished? Not only just getting up to the top of the depth chart, forget about that, finishing 6th in the Heisman Trophy as well, being Missouri's all-time single-season leading rusher. I mean, it's beyond belief, to be honest with you. Well, I will say, when you lay all that out, I don't think you can say that what Jontay Porter has accomplished recently is quite as impressive as that. But yet, you know what? The Jontay Porter story isn't finished yet either. And by the way, neither is Cody Schrader's at the NFL level either. I can't wait to see what happens there. But again, we're talking about the NBA level here, and actually the last 3 games, none other than Jontay Porter has gotten in the game for the Toronto Raptors. And when I saw Jontay was still playing in the G League, really going a hard road back to the NBA. You know, that's what's impressive to me about Jontay Porter, because really there was probably some pretty good money opportunities for him overseas that he could have taken. And by the way, good for him if he did. I'm not saying that would have been a bad decision whatsoever. I just thought it was incredibly impressive that Jontay was taking what was a pretty long shot, it seemed like, from the outside to come back to the NBA, because I'll just tell you, as a guy who's followed the NBA basically my entire life really, really closely on from a whole bunch of different angles, you just don't see guys disappear for 3 seasons and then come back, especially if a lot of it's because of injury as well. Porter, tore that knee a second time in recovery, the knee that I mentioned earlier, and just he's had various other ailments and injuries, and for whatever reason, the Porter brothers, Jontay and Michael, have just had problems staying healthy at times. Obviously, Michael Porter Jr., while not quite the same level, certainly not even close, really, he's significantly less as an explosive athlete that he was in high school before he got to Missouri. Well, obviously, he's still a really, really good player, one of the best streak shooters, especially at 6'10", in the entire league. And bottom line, the guy is going to make $200 million playing basketball plus before it's all said and done. So hopefully Jontay Porter, will get to cash in as well, because my goodness, not to that level, I'm sure, but what a special young man I really think that he is. Just from the outside looking in, just a guy who has always seemed like a very, very kind soul, number one, but behind that kind soul, those kind eyes, whatever you want to call it, is a guy who is absolutely tenacious and loves basketball, obviously to a level that I can barely even understand, because if that were me, I promise you I would have given it up long ago. He's from a well-to-do family with a brother who's obviously doing well. From what I understand, Jontay is married now, has a beautiful wife, probably will be starting a family soon and all that good stuff. So for him to stick it out like this and get back to the NBA after 3 years and all the injuries he's dealt with, I just think that guy deserves way more credit than he's gotten from Missouri fans so far. So hopefully I'm going to speak that into existence and people will start following my lead there and bragging about really what a great true son, in my opinion, Jontay Porter is. And by the way, his brother Michael, who comes back to Columbia all the time and represents Missouri, I know there's still some people who maybe have hard feelings about how that whole thing played out. It was certainly disappointing, the whole Porter experience on some level, right? But I did love Jontay's game, number one, that freshman season, what should have been his senior season in high school, by the way. A lot of people forget that, how good he was for Missouri that year. I've just always enjoyed watching him play basketball, and I just hope it works out for Jontay on a decent level here in the NBA. Maybe he can just get a real contract at some point, because a real guaranteed deal. If he can get that, man, what an accomplishment that would seriously be. But hey, thanks for sticking it out with me on this edition of Locked On Mizzou. Thanks for making this show your first listen every day, as I just realized I forgot to change the graphic back to my name bug once again from FanDuel. But you know what? They're not going to complain about the extra advertising, are they? And speaking of extra advertising, one more plug for Locked On Sports Today, the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Go ahead and subscribe to that on YouTube. It's Locked On Sports Today. So until next time, I'm John Miller, and this has been Locked on Mizzou.